Can we start now?
Sure.
First question is, what effects does social media have on ethics in journalism in Singapore?
On ethics in Singapore.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest implications of social media is that it allows for more points of view that is harder for the government to both monitor and control. I think one of the biggest, probably the biggest influence of the internet and social media in particular is something I refer to as the influence and authority inversion. Okay, so it used to be in a traditional media system, the influence is like a pyramid. If you could imagine, if a pyramid represents society, influence and authority is used to be almost entirely controlled by just the people at the top of the pyramid, and the rest of the people at the bottom had very little influence and very little authority. That's because mass media was controlled by big corporations or the government itself, right? Now it's the other way around. It's flipped over because of social media, and you now have a situation where anybody can create content and publish it. Anybody can have a wide audience, and indeed you're having a situation now where you're having independent media come up in Singapore especially, where it couldn't exist before. And what I mean by that is, before, if you wanted to set up a media company, it required a lot of investment. You had to take big offices, you had to have printing presses, you have to have a radio transmitter, your television transmitter, all of which it used to be only the government or big companies had access to that kind of resources. Now you can put up a YouTube channel and reach a bigger audience in MediaCorp. And it's just two guys who do that, right? With very little capital, cost of a few cameras and a few microphones and some talent, and that's basically all it is. So I think that's the biggest impact. It's the kind of democratization of influence, the democratization of content creation and the inversion of influence and authority.
Second question is, when it comes to freedom of speech, what do you think is the difference between local and foreign news outlets on social media? Because you used to work in Hong Kong and Philippines.
Yeah, I used to work while I worked in the Philippines, I worked in Hong Kong, and I worked here for MediaCorp as well. Well, I mean, it used to be, and you know, to be fair, because of digital media, I think one of the indirect consequences also is that the government has also gotten a lot more lenient than it used to be. One of the companies I used to work for was CNBC, which was a joint venture with Dow Jones. And once upon a time, the Dow Jones people used to get sued all the time by the government. And the Wall Street Journal was actually blocked from Singapore for a period of time. So, you know, there used to be a lot of episodes like that in the past, where when the government wasn't happy with coverage of a foreign news organization, they could sue that company and block circulation of that publication for a while. So I think a lot of that has changed. I think it's changed because the internet has made the distribution of content much more free and much harder to control. And you know, so that's created a whole new set of expectations among media consumers. But the other thing it's also changed, of course, is that even if the government wanted to control all of this, they would really have a hard time doing it, unless they take the route that, say, China does, where they actually actively block, police most of internet access. I don't think Singapore would ever want to do that, because it would affect them as a potential business hub, international business hub. So that's kind of the trade-off. So I think, I can't even think of the last time there was actually a case where the government actually complained hard enough to a foreign entity that they actually sued them or tried to stop their circulation. Now, I'm sure, some of that probably still happens behind the scenes, but I just think that, from a lot of it is, it's a lot freer now than it used to be, I think. It's a lot more open now.
As a freelance journalist, what concerns do you have when you speak on social media?
Interestingly, I think a freelance journalist has much more freedom to write about what he needs to write than a journalist who works full time for one business entity. Just because there are more immediate consequences if the organization you're working for is not happy with your work. I think I think a very serious kind of side effect of the fact that Singapore has had a very tightly controlled media environment for many years is that it's created this atmosphere almost of self-censorship, where even before the government tells a journalist, we don't like what you've written, they're already second guessing. They say, oh, somebody might get upset, or my boss might get upset, my editor might get upset. So they police themselves, they kind of censor themselves, which is probably the worst thing you could ever have when it comes to journalism, because that means the government doesn't even have to interfere. People are already stopping themselves from doing stuff. So so I think that still very much exists. And as a freelance journalist, you have less of those concerns, right?
Do you have any experience like working in some news agency?
Do I have?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I didn't work for a news agency, but I worked for a publication. I worked for a few publications as a journalist, as a writer in Manila and in Hong Kong. So the publishing company I worked for in Hong Kong, was an old school kind of print publisher, but it wasn't a news agency as such.
How do journalism ethics affect what you? It's the same question. Okay. How does social media affect media censorship?
Media what?
Media censorship.
How does? Sorry, say that.
How does social media affect media censorship?
I don't know if it affects censorship directly, but what it does is it gives the consumer alternate points of view that they may not actually get if there was no social media. So I'll give you an example. Here in Singapore, for example, recently one of the big things that people have noticed is that one of the things, for some reason, that Singaporeans are very interested in is this, what appears to be an ongoing feud between the Prime Minister and his brother, right? And there are things like, for example, there was a bit of a news story recently that Shen Yang, the younger brother, showed up at an event in support of the LGBTQ community in Singapore called Pink Dot. That's because he has a gay son who's in a same-sex marriage with another man. And so he was there, I guess, to support his son. And the fact that he was there was covered and became widely known because of social media, even if the mainstream media barely touched the story at all. Like, Straits Times. I could be wrong, but I remember reading something like there was originally a mention of him in Straits Times, and then it was removed. So there's quite a bit of that goes on. That there are things that the state-owned media will choose not to cover, but the public finds out about it anyway because of alternate media and social media.
Public interest. Yeah.
Huh?
The public interest.
Yeah, I mean, there's just I guess the point is, because of social media, if the public is interested in a story, it will come out anyway, and people will find out about it anyway. and because of Twitter, all it takes is one or two people to write it in a blog or write it in an independent, non-state-owned digital outlet, and get circulated by social media. And so in other words, a lot of it almost renders the whole idea of censorship moot and kind of irrelevant, because the story gets out anyway.
And what do you think is the favorite social media platform of journalists in Singapore, and why?
Oh, I don't know actually. I don't know if there's such a thing as a favorite platform. I mean, Facebook is still quite popular, but I have a lot of journalist friends, and from what I can see, they really just use Facebook just like any other consumer. It's just used for kind of like for personal things. Some people use Twitter, but Twitter, in terms of its impact and its its kind of influence, is still quite small in Singapore compared to, say, what Twitter is in the U.S. Like in the U.S., every journalist has a Twitter account, right? And what they publish and what they say is very much pushed out on Twitter. It doesn't appear to be the same phenomenon in Singapore. So my guess would be that the most commonly used social media platform among journalists is actually WhatsApp, because it's direct communications. You can create small groups, and WhatsApp is very, very often used here, not just in journalism but in business, right? Like teams will frequently create WhatsApp groups among themselves, and that's where a lot of the communication is. So that goes into this kind of area that they refer to as kind of like dark social, right? It's like social media that's not public, but it is still social media because it's people, just that it's not publicly visible.
How do the journalists balance objectivity and ethics on social media?
That's a very good question, and it's always going to be a conundrum, because the thing about social media and official channels is that it's very frequently used as an argument that somebody, whether he's a journalist or not, will voice an opinion in social media, get called for it, and then say, oh, but that's just my personal opinion, it has nothing to do with my official, it has nothing to do with my job or anything like that. And the reality is, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Whether you say it's for your personal capacity or for official, whether it's an official channel or an informal channel, it actually doesn't matter. The consequences are the same. So I think as a journalist, you have to be conscious about what you put out on social media, and you have to just assume that whatever opinion or whatever information you share via social media, you're going to have to be responsible for it, as if you published a story in your regular channel anyway. And whether it's the same thing, right? Whether you're a journalist, whether you're an executive, or whether you're the president of the United States, whatever you put on Twitter or on Facebook, people will call you out on. And the argument that, oh, that's just my personal opinion, is actually doesn't really hold any water anymore.
Yeah. What do you think of current phenomena of clickbait headlines?
They're the worst thing in the world. They're the worst thing in the world. I think, wow, this is going to be a long answer. I think it's killing the media industry, frankly. I think clickbait is killing the media industry, and here's why. When magazines and newspapers started migrating to online, the original migration was done with an assumption that you would you would retain the same amount of audience, and therefore if the same audience that follows you in print will also follow you online, then you can make the same amount of money, right, through advertising. And most publications went online with a view and even, you know, and this is especially true of publications that were never in print to begin with, that they were purely online, right? BuzzFeeds and all of that only started out with a completely digital model. All of which went under the assumption that as long as we have a large enough audience, we can make money on advertising and give away content for free. That turned out to be completely wrong. Because what happens over time is that advertising space in digital became more and more of a commodity. In other words, the amount of money that a publisher makes per page view or per ad impression is smaller and smaller and smaller every year, rather than bigger and bigger every year. So what that means is there's lots of businesses out there now, media businesses, that are realizing that no matter how big their audience gets, they can't make money. They can't make enough money on a pure advertising model. So what they've been doing is they're creating more and more sensational headlines to try and get more traffic to compensate for the fact that they're earning less and less money. But it just exacerbates the problem, right? It just creates more and more of this commodity around it. In other words, you're not creating real value for the viewer. And, you know, at the end of the day, what if you look at, say, a publication like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, these are some of the exceptions, right? These are companies that have successfully migrated online, are more successful than they've ever been, and continue to make money despite the fact that their main audience reach doesn't come from print anymore. And the reason for that is because they did not go down the clickbait route. They decided to maintain the quality and the integrity of their journalism, so that now, for all the other guys who did the kind of clickbait headline style of news, they're very difficult to tell apart, and therefore nobody cares about them, and therefore nobody cares enough about them to actually pay for subscriptions. Whereas if you're the Wall Street Journal, or if you're the Washington Post, or if you're the New York Times, you can say very clearly, subscribe to the New York Times, and the consumer knows, the subscriber knows exactly what value he's going to get. He's going to get New York Times level journalism, New York Times level integrity, right? Which is very hard to get anywhere else. So I think that's the problem. The companies that used clickbait approached their transition to digital with a very kind of short-sighted view. Whereas these companies like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, stuck to their principles and made sure that they maintained the quality no matter what.
And last question is, how do you perceive news which clearly contain false information or facts?
It's the worst thing in the world, frankly. I mean, that's the thing that, I think I think is what threatens journalism more than anything else. The whole phenomenon of fake news, most people don't realize, is not new. If you go back to the very early years of politics, let's say in the early years of the Republic in the U.S., right, when the U.S. became independent, even people like Benjamin Franklin would take out, paid ads in the paper and write fake stories about their rivals, and it was just kind of accepted as real. The problem now is that it's much more prevalent, and the reach is much wider, and it's much harder to tell the difference just because it's so commonplace. And I think the average internet user just can't tell the difference between what's fake and what's real, especially as younger generations come in, because your generation, for example, never grew up with newspapers, right? So you don't have this kind of standard in your head of like what goes into a newspaper story, what good journalism is supposed to look like. And so there's just so much false information out there. Now you add that to the fact that there is also an entire infrastructure in place which is used by the advertising industry. The digital advertising industry has kind of mastered the art of sticking messages in front of you at the right time, in front of the right audience, opportunistically because of data mining, because of cookies and all these things, right? And that same infrastructure is now used as that same infrastructure that's used to sell shoes, airline tickets, hotel nights, etc. is the same infrastructure that is now being used to manipulate politics, being used to change opinions in favor of one set of interests versus another set of interests. And there doesn't seem to be any sign of it improving. I mean, there's more awareness of it now, and the reason I am personally really angry at organizations like Facebook, especially, is because Facebook has known this for years, and they pretended that they didn't know that their platform was being used this way. And it's only when they got caught, because of things like what's the name of that that company that got outed for like selling all of this data. Anyway, so it's only because they got caught and because their partners got caught that they're now acting like they care. But actually, they don't. They've known about this for a long time, and they allowed their platform to be corrupted. And for as long as it's as nothing changes, this will continue. And I think it's bad in places like the U.S. and now of course the EU. But it was happening for years in the developing world. It happened in the Philippines, for example, manipulated an election there. It continues to happen all over Africa, all over South America. And in those parts of the world, people care even less. So it kind of continues unabated there. And I really don't see how that turns around.
Thank you.